She was just an apartment manager until she noticed a familiar pattern in one of her tenants' behavior while reviewing security camera footage. Her 20 years of FBI behavioral analysis experience told her one thing. This man was a serial killer, and now she was responsible for the lives of 200 people living in the building. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you're new here, welcome to The Last Witness. We share the most amazing untold stories of ordinary people with extraordinary secrets. Stories where someone becomes the final witness to incredible events. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And if you enjoy this story, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps us continue bringing you these incredible tales. Now let's get back to Margaret's story. Margaret Foster had been managing the Riverside Towers apartment complex in Manhattan for 5 years, and she'd developed a reputation among the 200 residents as someone who got things done. Broken elevators were fixed within hours. Noise complaints were handled diplomatically but firmly. Security issues were addressed before they became problems. To her tenants, Margaret was simply a competent, professional woman in her early 50s who kept their building running smoothly. She was friendly but not intrusive, helpful but not overbearing. Most residents barely thought about her beyond the occasional interaction about lease renewals or maintenance requests. What they didn't know was that Margaret Foster had spent the previous 20 years as a supervisory special agent with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She'd been one of the Bureau's top criminal profilers, specializing in serial killers and violent predators. Her psychological insights had helped capture some of the most dangerous criminals in American history. Margaret had worked cases that made headlines across the country: the Riverside Strangler, the Highway Killer, the Campus Predator. She'd interviewed hundreds of violent criminals, studied their patterns, learned to recognize the behavioral signatures that distinguished organized killers from disorganized ones, sexual predators from power-motivated killers. But her career had ended abruptly in 2018 when a case went wrong. Margaret had been leading the investigation into the Greenwich Village killer, a serial murderer who had claimed 7 victims over 2 years. Her psychological profile had led the task force to focus on a specific suspect, a man whose behavior patterns and personal history matched the profile perfectly. The suspect, David Chen, was arrested based largely on Margaret's analysis. The media praised the FBI's psychological profiling techniques. Margaret was featured in news articles and law enforcement journals as an example of how behavioral science could solve complex cases. But 6 months later, while Chen was awaiting trial, the real Greenwich Village killer struck again and again. The DNA evidence from the new crime scenes proved conclusively that Chen was innocent and that the real killer had been operating freely while an innocent man sat in jail. The media backlash was swift and brutal. Margaret's psychological profiling techniques were criticized as pseudoscience. Defense attorneys used the Chen case to challenge the admissibility of behavioral analysis evidence in courtrooms across the country. Margaret faced an internal investigation that questioned her methods, her training, and her judgment. While she was ultimately cleared of any procedural violations, the damage to her reputation was irreversible. She found herself relegated to administrative duties, removed from active casework, and treated as a liability by colleagues who had once respected her expertise. After 20 years of dedicated service, Margaret chose early retirement rather than continue working in an environment where her skills were no longer valued or trusted. The transition to civilian life was difficult. Margaret had defined herself through her work for decades. She'd never married, had few close friendships outside the Bureau, and had never developed interests or hobbies beyond her professional life. For 2 years, Margaret struggled with depression and a sense of purposelessness. She tried consulting work with private security firms, but most were reluctant to hire someone whose profiling techniques had been publicly discredited. She considered teaching, but universities were wary of associating their programs with someone who had been involved in such a high-profile case failure. In 2020, Margaret saw a job posting for an apartment manager position at Riverside Towers. The pay was modest, but the responsibilities seemed manageable: handling tenant relations, coordinating maintenance, overseeing security systems. It would give her structure and purpose without requiring her to confront the psychological demons that had destroyed her FBI career. Margaret discovered that she was surprisingly good at property management. Her attention to detail, honed through years of crime scene analysis, made her excellent at identifying maintenance issues before they became expensive problems. Her interviewing skills, developed through countless sessions with suspects and witnesses, helped her navigate tenant disputes and screen potential residents. Most importantly, her experience analyzing human behavior gave her insights into building security that most property managers lacked. She understood how predators selected their targets, how they gained access to secure buildings, how they exploited routine patterns to avoid detection. Under Margaret's management, Riverside Towers became one of the safest residential buildings in the neighborhood. Crime rates dropped dramatically. Residents felt secure enough to jog alone in the building's garage or walk through the lobby late at night. Margaret told herself she was content with this quiet, anonymous life. She was helping people in a different way than she had as an FBI agent, but she was still making a meaningful contribution to their safety and well-being. That changed on a Tuesday evening in March 2023. Margaret was in her office reviewing security camera footage from the previous week, something she did routinely to identify potential security vulnerabilities or concerning behavior patterns among residents. Most of what she observed was mundane: delivery personnel following proper protocols, residents using key cards correctly, occasional minor incidents like arguments in the lobby, or packages being delivered to wrong floors. But as Margaret watched footage from the previous Thursday evening, she noticed something that made her pause and rewind the recording. A man was entering the building at 9:47 p.m. According to the access logs, he was Robert Hayes from apartment 12B, a software engineer who had moved into the building 6 months earlier. Hayes was carrying a gym bag and appeared to be returning from a workout. Nothing unusual about that, but Margaret's trained eye caught something that most people would miss: the way Hayes moved through the lobby, how he positioned himself relative to other residents, the micro-expressions that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. Margaret had seen those same behavioral patterns countless times during her FBI career. The hypervigilance masked as casual awareness, the way Hayes scanned the lobby for witnesses before entering the elevator, the slight smile that appeared when he thought he was unobserved. These were the behavioral signatures of a predator. Margaret spent the next hour reviewing weeks of security footage, focusing specifically on Robert Hayes. The patterns became clearer with each recording she examined. Hayes left the building every Tuesday and Thursday evening, always carrying the same gym bag, always returning between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. But Margaret noticed that his routes through the lobby were never quite the same. He varied his path in ways that suggested he was conscious of camera angles and sightlines. More concerning was Hayes's behavior around female residents. He was superficially polite and friendly, but Margaret recognized the way he studied them, cataloging details, assessing vulnerabilities, filing information for future reference. Margaret cross-referenced Hayes's Tuesday and Thursday absences with local crime reports. What she found made her blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, there had been 7 sexual assaults in the neighborhood, all occurring on Tuesday or Thursday evenings. The attacks had happened within a 3-mile radius of Riverside Towers, suggesting that the perpetrator was familiar with the area. The victim profiles were also consistent. All were women in their 20s or 30s, all lived alone, all had been attacked in or near their homes by someone who seemed to know their routines and schedules. Margaret realized she was looking at the work of a serial predator who was using Riverside Towers as his base of operations. Hayes wasn't just a tenant, he was a hunter who had chosen her building as his hunting ground. But Margaret also knew that her credibility as a behavioral analyst had been destroyed by the Chen case. If she went to police with her suspicions about Hayes, they would likely dismiss her concerns as the delusions of a disgraced former agent trying to relive her glory days. She needed concrete evidence, not just behavioral observations. Margaret began her own investigation, using skills she hadn't exercised since leaving the FBI. She started by gathering more information about Robert Hayes, his rental application, employment history, previous addresses, references. What she discovered was deeply concerning. Hayes had moved frequently over the past 5 years, never staying in any location for more than 8 or 9 months. Each previous address was in a major metropolitan area where unsolved sexual assault cases had occurred during his residency. The pattern was clear to Margaret, but she knew it would seem circumstantial to law enforcement. She needed more direct evidence linking Hayes to the recent attacks. Margaret decided to conduct surveillance on Hayes during his next Thursday evening outing. She followed him at a distance as he left the building, watching as he walked several blocks to a neighborhood gym. But Hayes didn't enter the gym. Instead, he walked past it and continued several more blocks to a residential area. Margaret watched from across the street as Hayes began what could only be described as reconnaissance. Walking slowly through the neighborhood, paying particular attention to apartment buildings and single-family homes where young women lived alone. Margaret followed Hayes for 2 hours as he methodically scouted potential targets. She watched him test door handles, peer into windows, and note which apartments had lights on or off. It was textbook predatory behavior, exactly what she would expect from someone planning sexual assaults. But Hayes didn't attack anyone that night. Margaret realized he was still in the planning phase, gathering information about potential victims for future attacks. Margaret returned to Riverside Towers and immediately began reviewing the building's visitor logs and security footage more systematically. She was looking for evidence that Hayes had been bringing victims back to his apartment or using his access to the building for other criminal purposes. What she found was even worse than she'd expected. Hayes had been using his position as a trusted resident to gain access to information about other tenants. Margaret discovered that he had been volunteering to accept packages for female residents, giving him opportunities to learn their names, work schedules, and personal routines. More disturbing, Hayes had been befriending elderly residents who had master keys or access codes to various parts of the building. Margaret found security footage showing Hayes chatting with Mrs. Patterson from 8A, who served on the building's board and had access to all resident files and emergency contact information. Hayes was systematically gathering intelligence on every woman in the building, preparing for attacks that would be devastating not just for his direct victims, but for the entire community of residents who trusted Margaret to keep them safe. Margaret faced an agonizing decision. She could contact the police immediately, but her evidence was still largely behavioral and circumstantial. Even if investigators took her seriously, it might not be enough to arrest Hayes or prevent him from attacking someone. Alternatively, she could continue her surveillance and try to gather more concrete evidence. But every day she waited was another day that Hayes could escalate from planning to action. Margaret chose a third option. She decided to confront Hayes directly. She scheduled a meeting with Hayes under the pretense of discussing building policies about guest access and package deliveries. When Hayes came to her office the next morning, Margaret was prepared for the most important psychological interview of her career. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret began, "I wanted to discuss some concerns I have about building security." "Of course," Hayes replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I'm always happy to help with security matters." Margaret studied Hayes's micro-expressions as she spoke, looking for the tells that would confirm her suspicions. "I've noticed some unusual patterns in our security logs. People entering and leaving at odd hours, packages being delivered to incorrect addresses, that sort of thing." Hayes maintained eye contact and nodded attentively, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated stress. "I haven't noticed anything unusual, but I'll certainly keep an eye out. I'm particularly concerned about the safety of our female residents," Margaret continued, watching Hayes carefully. "There have been some incidents in the neighborhood recently." This time, Hayes's reaction was unmistakable. A brief flash of excitement crossed his features before he composed himself. "What kind of incidents?" Margaret had seen that same expression on the faces of dozens of predators during her FBI career. The barely concealed thrill that violent criminals felt when discussing their crimes. "Sexual assaults," Margaret said bluntly. 7 women in the past 6 months, all within a few miles of this building." Hayes leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. "That's terrible. Do the police have any leads?" Margaret watched as Hayes struggled to maintain an appropriate expression of concern while clearly wanting more details about the attacks. It was the behavior of someone who was intimately familiar with the crimes, not as an innocent bystander, but as the perpetrator. "They're investigating," Margaret replied, "but they're particularly interested in anyone who might have detailed knowledge of the neighborhood, access to information about potential victims, and the ability to move around without attracting suspicion. Hayes's composure finally cracked. Margaret saw genuine fear flash across his features as he realized that someone was connecting the dots between him and the attacks. "I should probably get to work," Hayes said, standing up abruptly. "If there's nothing else." "Actually, there is one more thing," Margaret said, remaining seated. "I used to work for the FBI, Mr. Hayes, 20 years in the behavioral analysis unit. I've interviewed hundreds of violent criminals, and I've learned to recognize certain patterns of behavior." Hayes froze in the doorway, his back still turned to Margaret. "I know what you are," Margaret continued. "I know what you've been doing. And I know what you're planning to do." Hayes turned around slowly, and Margaret saw that his mask of normalcy had completely fallen away. The expression on his face was cold, calculating, and utterly without empathy. "You don't know anything," Hayes said quietly. "You're a washed-up profiler who destroyed an innocent man's life. Nobody's going to believe you." "You're right," Margaret admitted. "My credibility was destroyed by one mistake. But I've been watching you for weeks, Mr. Hayes. I have security footage of your reconnaissance activities. I have records of your previous addresses and the unsolved crimes that occurred in each location. I have documentation of how you've been gathering information about residents in this building." Hayes stepped back into the office and closed the door behind him. Margaret felt a moment of genuine fear as she realized she was now alone with someone she believed to be a serial predator. "What do you want?" Hayes asked. "I want you to leave," Margaret replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Pack up your apartment today and move out. Find somewhere else to hunt." Hayes laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And if I refuse?" "Then I call Detective Martinez at the 19th Precinct and share everything I've discovered. Maybe they'll believe me, maybe they won't. But even if they can't arrest you immediately, you'll be under investigation. Every move you make will be watched. Every woman you approach will be warned. Your hunting ground will be compromised." Hayes studied Margaret for a long moment, weighing his options. Margaret could see him calculating whether it would be easier to eliminate her as a threat or simply move on to a new location. "You have until tomorrow morning," Margaret added. "If you're still here when I do my security rounds at 6 a.m., I make the phone call." Hayes nodded slowly, then left the office without another word. Margaret spent the next 24 hours in a state of heightened anxiety, wondering if she'd made the right choice. Part of her felt she should have contacted police immediately, regardless of the credibility issues. But she also knew that Hayes was intelligent enough to avoid arrest if he was warned that he was under investigation. By forcing him to leave immediately, Margaret had at least protected the residents of Riverside Towers, even if Hayes would likely find new hunting grounds elsewhere. The next morning, Margaret did her security rounds as promised. Apartment 12B was empty. Hayes had vanished during the night, leaving no forwarding address. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She'd successfully protected her residents, but she'd also allowed a dangerous predator to escape justice. 2 weeks later, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. "Miss Foster, this is Detective Lisa Chen with the NYPD. I understand you used to work for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit." Margaret's heart sank. "Yes, though I'm sure you're aware of the circumstances of my retirement. Actually, that's why I'm calling. We've arrested a suspect in connection with a series of sexual assaults in Manhattan. During questioning, he mentioned that he'd been forced to leave his apartment building by a former FBI agent who had figured out what he was doing." Margaret felt her hands begin to shake. "Robert Hayes?" "That's right. He's confessed to 7 attacks over the past 6 months, and we're linking him to similar crimes in 3 other cities. But here's the thing, Miss Foster. He's also confessed to planning attacks on several women in your building. He had detailed files on 12 female residents, including their work schedules, daily routines, and security vulnerabilities." Margaret closed her eyes, realizing how close she'd come to failing the people who trusted her to keep them safe. "How did you catch him?" "He tried to establish the same pattern in a different neighborhood," Detective Chen explained. "But the apartment manager there was suspicious of his behavior and called us. When we investigated, we found all the evidence you'd identified, plus quite a bit more." "What kind of evidence?" Photographs, surveillance equipment, detailed plans for multiple attacks. Miss Foster, your behavioral analysis was completely accurate. This man was absolutely a serial predator, and he was using residential buildings as hunting grounds exactly the way you suspected. Detective Chen paused before continuing. I wanted to call personally because I think you should know. Hayes told us that he'd operated successfully in 4 different cities using the same methods. You're the first person who ever identified his pattern and confronted him about it. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. After 5 years of doubting her abilities, questioning her judgment, and wondering if she'd lost her touch, she'd successfully identified and stopped a serial predator. There's one more thing, Detective Chen added. We'd like to ask for your help with the case. Your insights into Hayes's behavior could be valuable for understanding how he selected victims and planned his attacks. It might help us identify additional victims in other cities. Margaret hesitated. Working with law enforcement again would mean returning to a world that had rejected her, risking further damage to her already fragile professional reputation. But it would also mean using her skills to help victims and prevent future crimes. The work she'd dedicated her life to before one mistake had derailed her career. I'd be happy to help, Margaret said. The Hayes case became a turning point in Margaret's life. Her analysis of his behavioral patterns helped law enforcement identify and contact potential victims in multiple jurisdictions. Her insights into how he'd exploited building security systems led to changes in apartment management protocols across the city. More importantly, her successful identification of Hayes rehabilitated her reputation within the law enforcement community. The case demonstrated that her profiling techniques were sound and that the Chen case had been an anomaly rather than evidence of fundamental flaws in her methods. Margaret was offered several consulting positions with police departments and private security firms. She accepted a part-time role as a consultant with the NYPD, helping to train detectives in behavioral analysis techniques. But she also chose to remain as manager of Riverside Towers. This building is my beat now, she explained to Detective Chen. These residents are my responsibility, just like cases used to be at the Bureau. Margaret developed new security protocols for Riverside Towers that became models for other residential buildings. She created tenant education programs about personal safety and predator recognition. She established relationships with local law enforcement that ensured rapid response to any security concerns. Most importantly, Margaret used her position to watch over the community of people who had unknowingly provided her with purpose and redemption during the darkest period of her life. On quiet evenings, as Margaret reviewed security footage and walked through the building's corridors, she often thought about the chain of events that had led her from the heights of FBI success to public disgrace and finally to a different kind of meaningful work. Her career as a criminal profiler had ended because of one high-profile mistake, but that mistake had led her to exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, to identify and stop a predator who might otherwise have victimized dozens of innocent people. Sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways, and sometimes the most important cases were the ones that never made headlines. Margaret smiled as she completed her evening security rounds, knowing that 200 people would sleep safely because someone was watching over them with the skills and dedication of a trained protector. The last witness to her own professional downfall had become the first line of defense for a community that depended on her vigilance. It wasn't the career she'd planned, but it was the one her neighbors needed her to have. And that, she'd learned, was more than enough purpose for anyone. Thank you for listening to this incredible story here on The Last Witness. If you enjoyed Margaret's journey from FBI disgrace to apartment building hero and want to hear more amazing tales of ordinary people who become the final witnesses to extraordinary events, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these untold stories that deserve to be heard. What did you think about Margaret's decision to confront Hayes directly, rather than immediately involving police? Do you believe people deserve second chances to use their skills after professional setbacks? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts on these stories. And remember, sometimes the most important protection comes not from official authorities, but from ordinary people who refuse to ignore the warning signs around them. Until next time, keep listening and keep witnessing the truth.